Hi, my name is Noah Waleed, and this is going to be a presentation on Chapter 15 of the Routledge Handbook of Disaster Risk Reduction, including climate change adaptation. Chapter 15 of this handbook explores and focuses on the complex relationships between violent conflict, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. It highlights how climate change can exacerbate existing conflicts and how disasters can escalate tensions, affecting both the environment and social structures. The relevance of this is understanding the intersection between these issues because it's necessary for developing strategies that can reduce risk, improve resilience, and ensure sustainable outcomes, especially in the face of increasing climate stressors. So, the link between climate change and conflict. Climate change is often viewed as a threat multiplier, intensifying resource scarcity and migration pressures, which can increase the likelihood of conflict. Environmental stressors, such as droughts, floods, and extreme weather events, create competition for resources, such as water and arable land, which can fuel conflict, particularly in already fragile regions and states and conflict areas. Migration and resource scarcity are key drivers that link climate change to conflict. People displaced by environmental disasters may enter new regions, which could also cause tension over land, jobs, and resources, among other things. So this slide talks about some of the challenges in quantifying the relationships. Gathering quantitative evidence on the relationship between climate change and violent conflict is difficult. The process is time-consuming, requires historical perspectives, and demands country-specific expertise, which is talked about on page 152 in the textbook. Data on climate-induced conflict is often fragmented, or lacks the longitudinal scope necessary to establish conclusive links. Longitudinal scope, sorry about that. Despite the lack of precise quantitative data, intuitive linkages between climate stress and conflict still persist. Scholars and practitioners agree that while evidence may be incomplete, there is reasonable academic intuition that climate change can escalate tensions, though this relationship is highly context dependent. There's a strong need for long-term studies in the use of technologies like GIS and spatial mapping to improve data collection and analysis to get truly quantitative data. But much of this research is still in the early stages and is extremely expensive and time-consuming. While talking about this topic, it's also important to touch on the topic of securitization of climate change and the role that it plays. The securitization of climate change involves framing climate change as a security threat. While this approach has gained traction, it also raises concerns about creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, where perceived threats lead to militarized responses rather than adaptive humanitarian solutions, which is also talked about on page 154 in the textbook. This framing could lead to security-based policies that weaken effective disaster risk management and climate adaptation strategies. The rapid melting of Arctic ice also demonstrates this issue and is a major concern when talking about securitization of climate change. As political tensions over newly accessible resources and trade routes have prompted increased military presence in the region rather than cooperative climate mitigation efforts. The concern here is that framing climate change as a national security issue may divert attention from addressing the underlying socioeconomic vulnerabilities and environmental resilience required to tackle climate change effectively. So here we're going to talk about the complexity of climate conflict linkages. The relationship between climate change and violent conflict is complex and shaped by numerous factors. These include socioeconomic conditions, governance quality, political instability, and historical grievances. And that's just a very brief list when it comes to this topic. Disasters in active conflict zones remain under-researched, while qualitative data points to a link between climate change and conflict. The lack of quantitative data studies means the exact nature of these links is still poorly understood. This lack of clear data hinders efforts to formulate effective policy and response strategies, which is talked about in the textbook on page 158. Despite this, the intuitive linkage remains significant, and qualitative data still strongly suggests that disasters in conflict zones, particularly those influenced by climate change, have profound impacts, but more studies are needed to solidify these findings. So here we're going to talk about a few real-world examples and applications, and one of those is El Salvador. So El Salvador, under their leadership and president, has faced increasing social and environmental challenges. The regime's focus on security has led to controversial measures, which I'm sure a lot of us have heard about. But climate change is adding additional stress, particularly in relation to water resources and land use. The country faces increasing migration pressures as communities seek resources elsewhere. The implication for DRR and CCA here is El Salvador's approach underlines the importance of integrating climate adaptation with social security policies. This underscores the need for policies that not only secure borders, but also address the root causes of migration and resource scarcity driven by climate impacts. Another real-world application here is a little bit more well-known, a little bit more famous, especially because of the Everest situation and just because of the earthquake in Nepal in general. That wasn't too long ago. It's Nepal's infamous 2015 earthquake that devastated the region, and its recovery has been deeply influenced by socioeconomic and governance challenges. The country, which is vulnerable to climate-induced hazards like floods and landslides, faces significant challenges in rebuilding infrastructure and ensuring socio-economic resilience. The implications for DRR and CCA here on Nepal's experiences emphasizes the need for climate change adaptation strategies that incorporate socio-economic development, particularly in disaster-prone regions. The earthquake recovery process highlighted the complexities of integrating disaster risk reduction with climate change adaptation in a context marked by poverty and inadequate infrastructure. And this is still showing today. So here we talk a little bit about critical analysis. in data collection challenges of this topic, and the lack of precise data remains a major challenge regarding this topic in understanding the full extent of climate conflict links. While qualitative evidence exists, there is a clear need for better data collection systems to establish clear, actionable conclusions. The use of longitudinal studies and advanced technologies could improve the reliability of data, which is important for developing effective policies that are also sustainable. Continuing on the topic of critical analysis and some challenges regarding this topic are siloed approaches in DR and CCA. Is really the biggest one here is the divide between DR and CCA communities, which often leads to misaligned objectives, inconsistent terminology. Some examples are differing views on words like mitigation or vulnerability, just to name a few, and fragmented responses to climate and conflict issues. The lack of collaboration can delay effective decision making. More cross-disciplinary training and shared goals between DR and CCA researchers and practitioners are necessary for addressing complex global challenges and for making a real difference. So here's a couple of questions to think about. And one of those really is, how can GIS and mapping technologies such as spatial mapping help to bridge the gap in data collection and analysis regarding the link between climate change and violent conflict? What limitations might GIS have in this context as well, and how can those be addressed? Another thing to think about is how can governments and international organizations balance immediate disaster response efforts with long-term climate adaptation strategies to build resilience in vulnerable countries like El Salvador and especially places like Nepal. Both of these questions encourage discussion on short-term versus long-term approaches, and also to think about the role of different stakeholders in disaster resilience. So, ending with a brief conclusion here, is the relationship between climate change, violent conflict, and disaster risk reduction is really complex and requires integrated interdisciplinary approaches. But despite the challenges of data collection and disciplinary silos, initiatives such as the International Institute for Environment and Development, abbreviated as IIED, provide a promising framework for encouraging collaboration and developing effective strategies. The IIED works on integrating climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction into broader development agendas, with a focus on community-based resilience and policy advocacy to make sure that solutions are both sustainable and context-sensitive. To move forward, it is essential and, to be honest, necessary to expand data collection, bridge the gap between DR and CCA, and focus on holistic solutions that address both environmental and socioeconomic vulnerabilities if we're really going to make a difference in this area. And to end this slide, this PowerPoint presentation is just a list of references. This is just a few out of the many I've looked at. I really dug deep into this because of my interest in it. And I also apologize for some of my stumbling on some of my words. But yeah, thank you for watching the presentation.